your craft?
My craft is death.
What is your pledge?
My pledge is eternal service.
Hey guys, it's Matt here, and god, if there ever was a good time to become a Warhammer 40K fan, it's right now. It seems like this nearly 40-year-old franchise is more popular now than it ever has been. With a plethora of great games in the past few years, spanning many different kinds of genres, most recently the ridiculously badass Warhammer 40K Boltgun, there is a lot to be excited about. I made a first impressions video about that game as well last year, and yes, you should definitely also play that one. But today is not about that, because as much as I appreciate the over-the-top demon-killing madness of that game, this week saw the release of perhaps one of the most unexpected games of the year. After a period of time in which I graduated both middle school and college, we finally returned to the heretic-bashing, ore-crushing, chainsword-wielding shenanigans of Ultramarine Captain Titus, last seen being dishonorably discharged by the Inquisition on charges of heresy.
I am no heretic.
You lie! Only an agent of chaos could withstand such warp exposure.
I sent the demon to oblivion.
And my god, does this man make a comeback. Made by a different studio, published by a different company, and 13 years of innovation within the video game industry, there's more than enough reason to jump straight into this incredibly impressive, massively entertaining, fan service-filled concoction of madness as I present to you some gameplay and my first impressions of Warhammer 40K Space Marine 2.
You will take your place as an Ultramarine once more.
To understand why Space Marine 2 is such an interesting game, I quickly want to travel back to the other end of those 13 years. Back to when the first Space Marine released. Because in order to prepare for this sequel, I played its predecessor as well. And I'm glad I did. Despite Warhammer 40k's lore being more than suitable to grab anyone's attention, 40 years worth of adding new lore to this franchise makes the story of the Emperor and his buff blue minions ridiculously extended and, dare I say, pretty convoluted in certain places. Whether you play other 40k games, read up on the lore, or search all across YouTube for summary videos, I heavily recommend you to do at least some research before dipping into the endless pool of heretic-slaying insanity. Space Marine 2 is incredibly entertaining even when you don't know anything about this universe, but I think it's infinitely more enjoyable when you have even the slightest resemblance of knowledge as to what the hell is going on. And in my opinion, Space Marine 1 is a good starting point. Yes, the game does show its age, with its blurry textures, endless invisible walls and clunky animations and movement. And the gameplay is both very simplistic and ridiculously linear, but in broad terms, it's that kind of simplicity that makes the game so enjoyable. Just an entertaining Xbox 360-esque 6 hours of turning orcs and demons into a fine paste, getting to know the story of Captain Titus, and falling in love with the unnecessarily charismatic war boss Grimskull.
I'm Boss Grimskull! This whole planet is mine! Whoa!
40 euros on Steam is a lot of money in my opinion, but a full single player campaign, the endless replayability of its arena mode, or the pleasant surprise that this 13-year-old game still has an active player base in its multiplayer component, all make it worth your money. Also, as a quick side note, while the earlier mentioned Warhammer 40k Boltgun doesn't put you in the shoes of Captain Titus again, its story is a continuation of this one, where main protagonist Malum Cato is sent to Graia, the same planet visited in Space Marine 1 to find a similar power source that Titus came into contact with several years before.
It is my belief that rogue elements within the Adeptus Mechanicus may have been experimenting with a surviving fragment of Inquisitor Drogon's power source.
I will finish the work Captain Titus started.
And with a small early game spoiler warning, let's get into the main attraction of this video. Set 100 years after the events of the first game, we get introduced to this game's mechanics while slicing and shooting our way across the jungle planet of Kadaku. all seen through the eyes of an, at this point, unknown member of the Death Watch, which are basically some of the most elite soldiers amongst the Space Marines, and my one and only explanation as to why these are some of the most badass characters ever created will be a simple, just look at him. Of course you'll find out that this is actually Titus himself, who joined the Death Watch in an honorable form of self-imposed penance, I learned a new word today, after the events of the first game. The remainder of his kill team ironically all get killed themselves, and while Titus manages to complete their objective on this planet, even he bites the bullet. Yet it's not the end for him. Titus, now cleared of his wrongful accusations of heresy, had life-saving surgery performed on him known as Primaris, which now makes him part of the Primaris Marines. Basically an upgraded version of the already ridiculously powerful Space Marines. While eager to rejoin the Death Watch, Chaplain Quintus reminds him that now that he is free of any heretic wrongdoing, he must regain the trust of his former chapter. And so that's where the game starts. And so Captain Titus, now demoted to Lieutenant, rejoins the Space Marines. You're still with me? Good. Now that the difficult part is over and I convince myself that I have at least the basics of this world nailed down, the upcoming minutes are pretty much going to be in between all the head scratching and Google searching, gameplay feels exactly the way you want it to feel. Like an upgraded, modern day take on the gameplay that was presented back in 2011. As some of my friends and many of the reviews I've read have pointed out already, it resembles the sort of bulkiness that we used to see in games like Gears of War back in the day. Precision, aiming down sights and the plethora of attachments we see in many other shooters make way for stupendously powerful melee weapons and firearms which you can simply spray in a basic direction, since you'll undoubtedly hit something anyway. Though starting off limited, you'll soon get your hands on a wide variety of ranged weapons and explosives, and because of this game's seriously impressive swarming technology, hundreds if not thousands of aliens will grace your screen simultaneously. Which is why most of your time spent with Space Marine 2 will be so chaotic, you'll be surprised that Tyranid blood and guts don't actually start spilling into your lap. Seeing yourself fending off thousands of these creatures while running and jumping around in permanent Hulkbuster armor, all the while being basically worshipped as some sort of demigod by the quote-unquote regular soldiers. It will actually make you feel like the beefy one-man army the Call of Duty games so desperately want to make you feel like nowadays. While the gameplay loop might sound a bit too simplistic, there are a bunch of mechanics that build on the simple foundation laid in the first Space Marine game that I explained earlier. That game already had the ability to stun enemies by charging into them, and of course it had some simple execution animations. But the first newly introduced one here is parrying. Not anything revolutionary, but it's useful in any game you'll encounter it in. Successfully parrying, dodging an opponent's attack or kicking them back in any way always comes with an added benefit. In the case of the latter two, you can now immediately counter with a powerful gun strike. These kill smaller enemies instantly and pack a heavy punch against the bigger ones. Stun an enemy or do enough damage to one of them and you now get access to one of Space Marine 2's best mechanics, the new and improved executions. The only downside to all of this is the fact that this sort of gameplay caters towards an endless barrage of bullets and explosives. But the game kind of holds you back in that regard. Where the original game let you carry 4 guns at the time on top of your grenades and melee weapon, Space Marine 2 only lets you carry 2. Yes, you will find many guns scattered around the environment, but it was a blessing in disguise in that first game to be able to go from close quarters to long range to absolute devastation in the matter of seconds, instead of doing just some of those things, then frantically search around for another weapon to do some of those other things. And this limitation will also mean that me and my friends had so many instances where we ran out of ammo long before the waves of enemies stopped flooding us. It's a small complaint, but it does kind of break the power fantasy and the gameplay flow if you're smashing through hordes of enemies only to stop dead in your tracks to look behind some bushes just in case there might be some ammo there. It's almost a shame that the game looks as beautiful as it does, as well as that there are so many tiny details and references to the existing lore around every corner, since you barely get any breathing room in between the shooting to take it all in. Throughout the entire time me and my friends were playing the game, we found ourselves in awe of some giant cannon, massive cathedral, or stunning environmental backdrop, only to lose half of our health because we weren't paying attention to whichever evolutionary disgrace was already crawling our way again. We couldn't help it. 40K's techno-gothic inspired universe always has something awesome waiting for you. And because of that, this entire world will feel a lot more believable and alive in comparison to the sometimes quite bland and lifeless original. Also, you've heard it correctly, this entire game can be played with up to 2 friends. It's too early for me to say anything about the differences between playing alone and with friends as far as, for example, the difficulty goes. But what I can say is that this game works really well in co-op. Connecting to each other went very smoothly, the game has cross-platform capabilities, and only one connection error occurred after 3 hours of playtime, which supposedly has already been patched by the developers. But most importantly, thank the Lord for shared progression. This is no Far Cry 5 where all progression is limited to the host. No, as soon as you'll go back to playing alone, all your progression comes with you. I also like that this game actually took co-op play into account story-wise. Immersing yourself in a certain world just works better when everyone is allowed to play as an actual character in that story, instead of a bunch of people in a reskin of the main character that all disappear as soon as a cutscene hits. So while one of you guys will play as Titus, the other 2 will take the roles of Sergeant Gadriel and Brother Chiron. But do keep in mind that this is a single player focused game that you can also play in co-op, not a game actually built around co-op. And so outside of being able to revive each other and having an extra few sets of eyes, ears and muscles, there aren't any sort of mechanics in the game that really require working together. There are still some fun ways in which the experience slightly alters between characters in the later hours of the game, but you're gonna have to find out about those yourself, since I don't want to risk spoiling anything. And with that said, there isn't that much to complain about in Space Marine 2. I've seen some arguments on the internet about the single player being too linear, which I can understand up to a certain point. Those invisible walls I've talked about in the first game, those are still here in spades. The graphical improvements of Space Marine 2 make many places look like they have some sort of openness to them, only to see yourself being sent into a very specific direction by the game's boundaries. Don't get me wrong, a linear single-player story can be great. In fact, I think game developers nowadays have become too scared of the word linear, and so many games are forced into an unnecessary open world, open combat missions, open anything, just do whatever the fuck you want, we don't care sort of path. But you have to understand that there is such a huge difference between a linear game giving you some freedom of movement and a linear game forcing you through one single pathway blocked off by invisible walls. And in that case, Space Marine 2 could have given its players a bit more breathing room in my opinion. I also understand how gameplay can feel a bit like too much of the same. After playing the first 3 to 4 hours, many of the objectives so far boil down to shoot a lot of aliens. That's it. Variety of enemies hasn't been that spectacular at this point either, and so that initial wow factor of the horde mechanic can become a little bit repetitive. But I don't want to complain about that too much. Enemy variety will still increase massively, and dare I say that the game only gets better and better with every bulky stomp you take towards those initial end credits. That's why my biggest critique of the game will definitely not include the story, enemy variety, or variety in environments, but mostly gameplay variety. Yes, the sorts of opponents you'll face will change throughout the game, but the way in which you get rid of them barely does. Linear game or not, if all the game does is throw waves of enemies your way which you can only shoot at with an arsenal of weapons that in many instances fill way too similar roles, a lot of the game will feel like you just did this exact same thing in the last mission. Traveling to a new planet, progressing through Titus' story in those beautiful cutscenes, or temporarily getting your hands on a new gameplay mechanic always felt like it came at the exact right moment, right before tedium started to set in. But then not much later you'll go straight back into shooting, dodging and searching for ammo, as you did 10 minutes ago. In conclusion, these first few hours with Warhammer 40K Space Marine 2 have been an absolute blast. It's both a worthy follow-up and massive upgrade to the 2011 original. A fun single player and co-op game for people who enjoy the hack and slash genre. And it will probably feel like early Christmas morning for anyone who is even remotely interested in the Warhammer franchise. Whereas last year's Boltgun piqued my initial interest in the world of 40k, Space Marine 2 now solidified it. Simple yet effective gameplay, beautiful graphics, and an interesting story with characters you can empathize with despite the larger than life role they find themselves in, makes this game worth your time and your money. I personally love the fact that there is still a place in the video game industry for a simple linear story you can finish within 6 hours, and hope that Space Marine 2 can be a forerunning example as to why not all games have to be massive 200+ hour open world RPGs. And of course the inclusion of co-op makes the whole game even more enjoyable. While my time with the game has been short for now, my time with Titus and the gang felt like the perfect combination between over-the-top action and some well-deserved character development. And since there are still 2 complete separate game modes waiting for me, I think my time with this game is far from over. Thanks for watching. As always, I hope you liked this video. Please like it and subscribe to my channel if you did, and leave a comment below to let me know your opinion on the game so far. Massive thanks to my friend Jacco, who has been our walking Warhammer encyclopedia throughout this whole playthrough, and my friend Jeen, who invited me and Jacco to play Space Marine 2 with him on his livestream. Feel free to check out his Twitch channel as well, which I've linked in the description below, though keep in mind that he does all of his live streams in Dutch. Jacco, Jeen, nogmaals dankjewel, and I'll hopefully see the rest of you in my next video. Bye!
Even if I am slain, I will leave you with wounds I sure remember.